Life Stories brings you powerful tales that touch the heart and ignite change. In today's story, we dive into a suburban park where a peaceful afternoon takes a dark turn. A boy sitting quietly becomes the target of prejudice and unwarranted aggression, leading to a dramatic confrontation that uncovers injustice and highlights the strength of family bonds. Witness how love, courage, and accountability can shine through even the darkest moments. Subscribe to our channel to begin today's story and stay tuned for more inspiring tales that remind us of the power of standing up for what's right. The day began like any other in the charming suburbs of Springfield. The sky was a canvas of soft blues, dotted with fluffy white clouds that drifted lazily. Children pedaled their bikes down pristine sidewalks, their laughter ringing out like wind chimes on a summer breeze. Families strolled with their dogs, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors as birds sang a melody so carefree it seemed to paint the air itself. It was a picture of tranquility, the kind of peace people dreamed of when imagining suburban life. On a park bench nestled under the shade of a grand oak tree sat Jake Andrews, a boy no older than 14. His brown hair fell neatly across his forehead, and his attire was tidy, a reflection of the respect his family had instilled in him. Lost in the world of his phone, Jake was unaware of the life buzzing around him. For him, this was a routine moment, a chance to pass time while waiting for his father, who was running late. As Jake scrolled through his phone, unaware of the quiet story unfolding, the air shifted. A police cruiser rolled to a deliberate halt at the curb, its presence sending an unspoken ripple through the serene neighborhood. The car's tires hissed against the asphalt as if warning the world of its arrival. Out stepped Officer Eric Blake, a tall, imposing figure whose hardened expression bore the weight of countless scowls etched into his face over years of service. His uniform was crisp, his stride purposeful, but his eyes carried a sharpness that made the atmosphere heavy. Jake glanced up briefly, his focus quickly returning to his screen. But Officer Blake had already spotted him. His gaze lingered on the boy, a furrow forming between his brows. Something about Jake, perhaps his stillness amidst the activity, or perhaps something more insidious, drew the officer forward. His boots crushed the grass underfoot, each step carrying a weight of authority as he approached the park bench. "Hey, kid," Officer Blake barked, his voice cutting through the peaceful hum of the park. Jake flinched slightly but quickly recovered, looking up with polite curiosity. "What are you doing here?" Jake blinked, startled by the sharpness of the question. "Just waiting for my dad, sir," he replied, his voice measured but tinged with nervousness. Despite his unease, he remembered the lessons his parents had taught him: respect authority, even when it's hard. He added the "sir" like a shield, hoping it would soften the man's tone. But Officer Blake's expression only darkened. "This isn't a hangout for kids who don't belong. Do you even live around here?" His words dripped with suspicion, each syllable a challenge. Jake hesitated, unsure how to respond. He felt his heart quicken, his pulse thudding in his ears. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "I'm just waiting." The officer's gaze flicked to the phone in Jake's hands. "Let me see that," he demanded, extending a hand. His tone brooked no argument, the words carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. Jake hesitated, clutching the phone instinctively. "Why, sir? I haven't done anything wrong," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt inside. Officer Blake's patience snapped. "Did I stutter? Hand it over now." The words cracked like a whip, the force behind them causing Jake to shrink slightly in his seat. Reluctantly, with a quiet sigh, Jake held out the phone. His fingers lingered for a moment, as if reluctant to let go of the device that felt like a lifeline. The officer snatched it from him, inspecting it with disdain. His lips curled into a sneer as he studied the device. An expensive model far beyond what he deemed appropriate for a boy Jake's age. "What kind of kid needs a phone like this?" he muttered, his voice full of derision. "Bet you stole it." Jake's head shot up, his eyes blazing with indignation. "No, sir," he said, his voice rising with a mixture of defiance and hurt. "My dad bought it for me. It's mine." But his words fell on deaf ears. With a sudden, violent motion, Officer Blake raised the phone above his head and slammed it to the ground. The sound of shattering glass cut through the air, and Jake watched in stunned disbelief as the device he treasured lay in ruins at his feet. The world seemed to stop. "There," Blake said coldly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Let's see you play your games now." Jake's chest tightened. His breath caught in his throat. He looked down at the shattered remains of his phone, his mind racing to make sense of the cruelty he had just witnessed. His lower lip trembled as tears threatened to spill. But he fought to keep them at bay. He wouldn't give the man the satisfaction. Around them, the park had grown eerily silent. A few onlookers, drawn by the commotion, stood frozen in place. Their faces reflected a mix of shock, horror, and fear, their instincts to intervene suppressed by the heavy aura of authority radiating from the officer. Jake swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he reached for his backpack. From it, he pulled an older phone, its screen cracked and its buttons worn. With unsteady fingers, he dialed a number, his voice trembling as he said, "I'm calling my dad." Officer Blake smirked, a mocking chuckle escaping his lips. "Go ahead, kid. What's he going to do? Sue me?" His words, laced with contempt, hung in the air like a challenge. Jake didn't respond. He held the phone to his ear, his heart pounding as he waited for the line to connect. In that moment, he felt small and powerless. But he clung to a single thought: his father would make things right. The stage was set. The first act of an unfolding drama that would change everything. The faint sound of an engine growing louder was the first sign that Jake's call had reached its intended destination. The sleek black SUV appeared moments later, gliding smoothly into the park's parking lot like a shadow cutting through the sunlight. Heads turned as the imposing vehicle came to a stop, and its doors swung open with deliberate precision. Out stepped Dwayne Johnson, known to the world as The Rock. But to Jake, he was simply Dad. His presence was commanding, his broad shoulders and towering frame exuding a quiet strength. The crowd instinctively parted as he approached, his movements deliberate, his expression a mask of tightly controlled fury. The easy charm he was known for was absent, replaced by an intensity that made the air feel heavier. Dwayne's eyes scanned the scene, taking in the shattered remains of Jake's phone, the boy's trembling hands, and the looming figure of Officer Blake. The pieces of the story came together in an instant, and his jaw clenched. Though his voice was calm when he spoke, it carried the weight of a father's wrath. "What happened here?" he asked, his tone deceptively even as his dark eyes locked onto Officer Blake. His words weren't just a question, they were a demand for accountability. Officer Blake, who had been so assured of his authority moments earlier, now found himself faltering. The sheer force of Dwayne's presence seemed to strip away his bravado. But he quickly recovered, his ego unwilling to bow without a fight. "Just teaching your kid some respect," Blake said, his tone laced with false confidence. He had a phone he couldn't possibly afford. His words trailed off, and his gaze flickered to the shards of the destroyed device. The weight of his actions suddenly felt heavier under Dwayne's unyielding stare. Dwayne took a step closer, closing the distance between them. His voice dropped, low and steady, each word landing with the force of a hammer. "You decided to destroy it," he growled, his words sharp enough to cut. "That's how you teach respect. By humiliating and intimidating a child." Blake tried to stand his ground, his posture rigid, but the beads of sweat forming on his brow betrayed his discomfort. "I was doing my job," he muttered, though the words rang hollow. "Kids like him." "Kids like him?" Dwayne interrupted, his voice rising ever so slightly. His question hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. "Do you mean respectful, well-mannered kids who mind their own business? Or do you mean kids with skin like his?" The crowd, which had been quietly observing, collectively gasped. Dwayne's words cut through the veneer of authority Blake had been hiding behind, exposing the prejudice that had fueled his actions. The officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth was laid bare, and no amount of justification could erase it. Dwayne's gaze shifted momentarily to Jake, who stood frozen nearby, his hands clutching the strap of his backpack like a lifeline. "You okay, buddy?" he asked, his voice softening for the first time. The gentleness in his tone was a stark contrast to the controlled fury he had directed at Blake. Jake nodded, though his lips trembled slightly. "I'm fine, Dad," he said, though the cracks in his voice hinted at the turmoil he felt inside. The sight of his father standing up for him, unshaken and resolute, was both comforting and overwhelming. Turning back to Blake, Dwayne's voice hardened once more. "You think you can bully kids and get away with it," he said, his tone a mix of disgust and determination. "Let me show you what happens when you mess with the wrong family." Before Blake could respond, Dwayne bent down and picked up a shard of the broken phone, holding it between his fingers like a piece of evidence. He turned it over in his hand, his expression unreadable, before fixing his gaze on Blake once more. "You're going to replace this," he said, his words leaving no room for argument. "And you're going to answer for what you've done." Blake's confidence, already shaken, crumbled further under the weight of Dwayne's words. But the tension was far from over. As Dwayne reached for his own phone to escalate the matter, the hum of another engine interrupted the scene. A second police cruiser pulled into the lot, its presence a stark reminder that the situation was still unfolding. From the vehicle emerged Captain Robert Rodriguez, Officer Blake's superior. His expression was one of confusion as he surveyed the gathered crowd, the shattered phone, and the two men standing at the center of it all. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice authoritative but tinged with concern. Dwayne turned to face the captain, his resolve unshaken. "This man destroyed my son's phone," he said, his voice firm. "And he did it because he decided my son didn't belong." Captain Rodriguez's gaze shifted to Blake, who now stood stiff and pale, his earlier confidence replaced by a visible unease. The captain's expression hardened as the weight of the accusation settled. Without hesitation, he turned to Blake. "Is this true?" Blake's attempt to protest was feeble, his voice faltering as he sputtered out a weak defense. But it was clear to everyone watching that the evidence and the truth were stacked against him. The tension in the air was electric, the crowd holding their breath as the confrontation reached its boiling point. Justice was on the horizon, but the lessons of the day were far from complete. Captain Robert Rodriguez's gaze remained fixed on Officer Blake, his expression a blend of disbelief and growing disappointment. The accusation against Blake had cast a long shadow over the idyllic neighborhood. And the crowd, now a sea of watchful faces and recording phones, waited in tense silence for what would happen next. Blake opened his mouth, his voice shaky, attempting to defend himself. "It wasn't like that, Captain," he stammered. "The kid, he was acting suspicious. And You what?" Dwayne interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through the officer's excuse like a blade. "You assumed he didn't belong here? You assumed he didn't deserve to sit on a park bench and wait for his father? And then you destroyed his property because you could." Dwayne's words hung heavy in the air, each syllable a powerful rebuke. The crowd murmured in agreement, their expressions a mix of anger and sorrow. Among them were families, neighbors, and strangers who had come together to witness a moment that would be etched into their memories. Captain Rodriguez raised a hand, signaling for quiet. His tone was measured but firm as he addressed Blake. "Is there any truth to what he's saying?" he asked, though his voice carried the weight of an accusation. "Did you destroy this boy's phone?" Blake's face flushed crimson. He glanced at the crowd, at Dwayne, and then at the remnants of Jake's phone on the ground. For a moment, it seemed as though he might deny it. But the weight of the evidence and the eyes of the onlookers left him with no choice. "Yes, Captain," Blake admitted reluctantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did." The confession sent a ripple through the crowd, their gasps and murmurs underscoring the gravity of the situation. Dwayne stood firm, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze unwavering as he watched the captain process the admission. Captain Rodriguez let out a heavy sigh, the kind that spoke of weariness and frustration. "Officer Blake," he said, his voice steady but laced with disappointment, "you've not only abused your authority, but you've also tarnished the reputation of this department. Hand over your badge and gun. Effective immediately. You're suspended pending an investigation." The words hit like a gavel striking the bench. Final and unyielding. Blake's shoulders slumped, and his hands trembled slightly as he removed his badge and weapon, placing them in the captain's outstretched hand. His once commanding presence had diminished to that of a man defeated, weighed down by the consequences of his actions. The crowd erupted into murmurs of approval, their faith in justice momentarily restored. But Dwayne wasn't done. Stepping forward, he met Captain Rodriguez's gaze with unwavering resolve. "Suspension isn't enough," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge. "My son deserves more than an apology and a slap on the wrist for this man." The captain nodded, acknowledging the truth in Dwayne's words. "You're right," he said, "and there will be a formal investigation into this incident. Officer Blake will be held accountable for his actions." Dwayne's expression softened slightly, but his determination remained. He turned to Jake, who had been quietly standing nearby, his small frame dwarfed by the towering figure of his father. "You okay, buddy?" Dwayne asked again, his voice gentle and filled with concern. Jake nodded, but the tension in his posture betrayed his lingering unease. "I'm fine, Dad," he said, his voice quieter now. "But my phone." Dwayne placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "We'll take care of it," he promised, his tone resolute. "And we'll make sure this never happens again." Turning back to Captain Rodriguez, Dwayne extended his hand. "Thank you for taking this seriously," he said, though his tone hinted at the expectation of follow-through. The captain shook his hand firmly, a silent agreement passing between the two men. As Blake walked away, head bowed and steps heavy, the crowd began to disperse, their whispers carrying fragments of the story that would undoubtedly spread throughout the town. But for Dwayne and Jake, the moment wasn't over. There were still pieces to pick up, both literal and emotional. "Come on," Dwayne said, guiding Jake towards their car. "Let's get you a new phone. But first, I think we could both use a little time to breathe." Jake glanced up at his father, a flicker of a smile breaking through his somber expression. Despite the pain of the day, the unwavering support of his dad filled him with a sense of safety and pride. And as they walked away from the remnants of the confrontation, the boy knew one thing for certain: his father would always stand by him, no matter the cost. The day had begun in serenity and turned dark, but it was far from over. For Jake, it was a lesson in resilience. For Dwayne, it was a reaffirmation of his role as both protector and teacher. And for everyone watching, it was a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right. In the end, justice prevailed, but the lesson lingered far beyond the confrontation. Jake walked away with a new phone, but more importantly, a strengthened bond with his father, who showed him the power of standing up against injustice. Dwayne's unwavering determination to protect his son sent a powerful message not just to Jake, but to everyone who witnessed the day's events. Officer Blake's actions served as a stark reminder of the prejudice that still exists. But the courage of a father defending his child proved that change begins when people refuse to stay silent. As father and son left the phone store, their laughter and shared moments of love reflected a brighter future. Life is full of stories like this, stories of resilience, love, and justice. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring life stories that remind us of the best and worst of humanity.